Hi folks, and welcome to Philosophy According to Eddie. And today we're going to be looking at the cosmological argument for the existence of God. This is one of two a posteriori arguments for God's existence, i.e. from experience. The first one is the teleological argument. That was covered in the previous video. The cosmological argument, comes from Aristotle's Four Causes, and it was developed by Thomas Aquinas. And in his first, second and third ways, which are his ways to demonstrate God's existence, to accurately quote the Latin, first, second and third, as opposed to the fourth and the fifth way being the teleological argument. The idea is that God's existence can be proven, or at least demonstrated, by the fact that the universe exists, and the fact that it has common themes running through it, such as motion and causation, which prove that God was able to create the universe and did. Aquinas is the main thinker, but William Temple, Gottfried Leibniz, Paul Tillich, and Father Copleston all agree with the cosmological argument. Voltaire, Bertrand Russell, and of course David Hume all argue against it, and we'll be weighing up these opinions throughout the video. Thomas Aquinas, being a big fan of Aristotle, built his ideas on an Aristotelian approach, an empirical one, and his first three ways cover very similar ground to Aristotle. His first way to demonstrate God's existence is the prime mover, language taken immediately and specifically from Aristotle. The idea is that there is an argument from motion. Everything is changing and moving within the universe, and it therefore has to be moved by something. Unlike Aristotle's prime mover, Thomas Aquinas believes in a God who knows of us and cares about us. It's more of a pushing motion to start a process off, rather than the Aristotelian pulling motion with a prime mover unknowing of people and drawing them behind. So motion needs a mover, leading us to the second way, the first cause. In the same way there needs to be a first motion, there needs to be a first cause for everything, including motion. Everything needs to start from something creating that first movement. God is the creator of that first movement. We can regress back to the first action, i.e. this was caused by this, caused by this, caused by this, and we can work our way back infinitely, potentially, if we don't have God. But Aquinas suggests we can't go back infinitely. That's illogical. We can't conceive of that. Something's got to have started it, and that something is God, the first cause, the first mover. So you need to have a first action or a first actor to create that action. A third way, therefore, building upon the previous 2 points. All of our nature is contingent, i.e. it would have only happened if it was started by something. So working our way back, this would happen if, this would happen if, this would happen if, or if you like, this did happen because. But the very first actor, the very first action, the very first motion had to come from something different. It couldn't have been started by anything else. So if it couldn't have been started by anything else, it has to be necessary. Its existence has to be necessary. God must exist externally to all of these whats and ifs, and there's got to be no question of God's existence. Otherwise, something would have caused God. Nothing caused God. And God caused everything. So therefore, God has to exist, and God has to exist forever, eternally, and necessarily. It's quite a clever argument when you think about it, because it proves that God must exist by proving that God has to start everything, And that's proven by the fact that everything's changing, which we can measure. So it is empirical. However, it is not without criticism. There are some criticisms of Thomas Aquinas, and unsurprisingly, David Hume shows up again. If you've watched the teleological argument video, you'll know that Hume has a lot of issues with this a posteriori proving of God. Hume suggests immediately infinite regress is not necessarily impossible. It can potentially exist in the same way that it could not exist. The two options are equally there. We have no proof that one is stronger than the other. In fact, Temple, who is actually in favour of the cosmological argument in general as a good Christian, turns against Aquinas here and says, although we can't imagine infinite regress, we can imagine infinite, we can imagine regress, and although we can't picture it, we can contemplate it. We can recognise that this is a possibility. So Temple actually turning on his own side there. Cause and effect is another big one. Just because there's a cause doesn't mean there's an effect. Just because there's an effect doesn't mean there's a cause. So this idea of a chain of causes and effects, Hume calls into question. It could well be that a cause becomes an effect, but at what point does a cause change from being a cause into becoming an effect? The fact that there's doubts around this means that it becomes harder to then identify that you've got this simple chain of actions. Also, correlation and causation are very different things. If I throw a brick at a window and the window smashes, can we really prove that the two events are linked? We can assume they are, but it's almost impossible to prove. So always round, Hume is pulling apart the assumptions of cause leading to effect. And another classic one, sort of going back to the cause and effect idea, is if we stop time between the cause creating the effect, at any stage between the cause happening and the effect happening, while the cause is creating the effect, if we stop time, where would we find the cause creating the effect? Where would the changeover be? Is it possible? These are the issues that Hume brings up. They're all quite difficult to picture, but the point is they're unravelling the assumptions of the argument. From Hume, then, we can then sort of see that others have suggested, well, maybe we can't actually determine what God is. It's all very well and good to talk about God as being outside the universe, being a separate substance, but we can't actually test this. We know about chemical causes for explosions, we know about physical causes for the weather. But if we can't access God, if we can't test God, if we can't take a sample of God, how can we actually understand how God acts as a cause? And finally, Russell looks at the linguistic side and looks at the logic side. There's this talk of a necessary being in the third way, that God must be necessary. Russell acknowledges that necessary is a reality. You do need things like necessary truths. A triangle has three sides. But that does not then indicate that there must be a necessary being. Can a being really be necessary? Or is this an inductive leap? Russell suggests that the universe just is. Now, that's not very satisfying, but it's just as likely, according to Russell, if not more likely, that that is the case than there is a necessary God who is the first cause. After Aquinas' arguments that God must have caused the universe became criticised, philosophers began then to look more into the idea of God as an explanation. for the universe. This way, God can still be seen as interacting with the universe rather than just causing it and letting it go. And this is where Gottfried Leibniz comes in. If God is the explanation for the universe, Leibniz argues that everything makes a lot more sense. He thinks that essentially the universe is a harmonious whole. Everything seems to work together. It must have an explanation for why. All the parts have an explanation. You can even use the teleological argument for that. All the parts have an explanation, so surely the universe as a whole must have an explanation. That's the idea of cosmological, looking at the universe as a whole. So surely there must be an explanation for the whole if there's an explanation for the parts. Paul Tillich took this a little further and said basically God is the ground of being. God is the explanation for everything that exists. It's based on a scientific idea that for every event, truth, or for anything that exists, any existence, there must be a significant explanation. And Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason is that God is the only sufficient explanation for all of this harmonious, universal linkage, all of these explanations coming together. There are some problems with the idea of sufficient reason. First of all, Voltaire criticises it by looking at the presence of evil. On All Saints' Day in 1755, an earthquake killed tens of thousands of people, and a tsunami from the Algarve to Morocco wiped out huge amounts of homes and livelihoods. And Voltaire suggests that if God is the explanation for this, then God, as we understand him, as all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful, cannot exist. Russell takes a more logical approach to this. He talks about cause and explanation. The suggestion of sufficient reason is that there is a difference between cause, setting something in motion, and explanation. But when talking to Father Copleston on the radio, it seems that Copleston sees cause and explanation to essentially mean the same thing. And Leibniz doesn't differentiate between these two terms either. Firstly, this means that sufficient reason is open to all the same criticisms as Aquinas' arguments. But secondly, when Russell mentions quantum atoms which seem to have no cause, quantum physics acting in ways outside our laws of physics, Copleston agrees. He suggests that yes, these things do exist, and yet doesn't see it damaging to his argument that these things can seem to have no reason for existing, and yet be still arguing for the idea of sufficient reason. After that, Russell then goes back to the idea of the fallacy of composition. Just because everything in the universe appears to have had some sort of explanation doesn't mean the universe as a whole has an explanation. If you want to look back at the fallacy of composition, look to the teleological argument video. Basically, just because the parts have one property doesn't mean that the whole has the same property. So, there may be an explanation for everything in the universe, but the universe itself doesn't need an explanation, according to Bertrand Russell. He's happy to say the universe just is. So we've now looked at the cosmological argument. The suggestion that the universe as a whole has to have some sort of cause, some sort of explanation, and that is God. And Aquinas, Leibniz have suggested that there are reasons why there is a cause. Others, such as Hume, Russell, suggest that there isn't. We are still into the area of the unknown. Is it possible that the universe came about, like Hume says from the Epicurean thesis, that it could have come about randomly? Even if it did come about somehow, do we have to leap to this idea of a transcendent God? Or is it possible, factually, all of these things do point towards a God, and if so, the Christian conception of God? If you've got any questions, of course, let me know, as ever. Thanks for watching. See you next time.